They thought humans needed their protection, until Earth protected them instead. The first alien ship arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, hanging silently above the Pacific Ocean like a second moon. It did not fire weapons. It did not send threats. It simply opened a channel and spoke in perfect English, as if it had been listening to human radio for a very long time. "People of Earth," the voice said, calm and warm, "you are not alone, and you are not ready. We have come to help you." Within hours, every screen on the planet showed the same message. Governments scrambled. Militaries went on high alert. News anchors read the words over and over, their hands shaking slightly, their voices trying to stay steady. The ship was enormous, shaped like a curved leaf, its surface a soft silver blue. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like a gift. But gifts, humanity would soon learn, can come with strings attached. The aliens called themselves the Kalen, and they were the leading species of an ancient alliance known as the Custodian Concord. The Concord had existed for over 4,000 years, a peaceful union of species dedicated to one single purpose: protecting younger civilizations from the dangers of the galaxy. War, plague, self-destruction, first contact gone wrong. The Concord had seen it all, and had built their entire culture around preventing it from happening again. Humanity, they explained, had been watched for over 2 centuries. Radio signals had reached Concord listening posts back in the 1800s, faint and strange, but enough to place Earth on a watch list. As human technology grew, nuclear weapons, space travel, and finally, the first working fusion reactor 3 years ago, the Concord had decided it was time to step in. "You have grown fast," the Kellen ambassador said, during the first formal meeting at the United Nations. Her name was Sael, and she stood nearly 7 feet tall, with skin like polished pearl, and large, gentle eyes that never seemed to blink. "Too fast, perhaps, for your own safety. You have weapons that could end your species 100 times over. You have not yet learned to control your worst instincts. This is exactly the moment when young civilizations are most fragile. We have seen it before. We do not wish to see it again." The Concord's proposal was simple, at least on the surface. Earth would become a protectorate. The Concord would place a fleet in orbit, small, they promised, purely defensive, to shield humanity from external threats. In exchange, humanity would agree to certain restrictions. No further development of weapons beyond a certain threshold. No further expansion into space without Concord supervision. All contact with other alien species would be filtered through Concord representatives. It was protection, but it was also a leash. Not everyone was pleased. General Elena Reyes sat in the back of the negotiation room, arms crossed, watching Sael speak with the kind of practiced calm that came from decades of dealing with people who thought they knew everything. Reyes was 52 years old, a career military officer who had fought in 3 wars and buried more friends than she liked to remember. She did not trust easy answers, and this felt like the easiest answer she had ever heard. Beside her sat Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist who had spent the last 10 years trying to understand the strange energy signatures the first probes had picked up from deep space. He was the opposite of Reyes in almost every way: quiet, thoughtful, more comfortable with equations than arguments, but he shared her unease. "They keep saying protection," Webb murmured to her, as Sael continued her speech about shared prosperity and peaceful cooperation. "But protection from what, exactly? They haven't named a single threat." Reyes nodded slowly. "That's what worries me too." After the meeting, the 2 of them were escorted, along with a dozen other representatives from around the world, onto a Concorde shuttle. It felt wrong to call it that. A shuttle implied something small, something ordinary, and this vehicle had no visible controls, no seats that looked like seats, no sound of any engine at all. It simply lifted into the sky, silent as thought, and carried them up to the massive leaf-shaped ship. Inside, the ship was beautiful in an alien way. Corridors curved instead of running straight. Light came from the walls themselves, soft and shifting in color, depending on the mood of the room, or so their guide explained. Everything felt designed, intentional, perfect, and just slightly too perfect, like a museum instead of a home. Sael led them through the ship personally, pointing out gardens grown in floating platforms, libraries containing the recorded history of 1,000 worlds, medical bays capable of healing wounds that would kill a human in seconds. It was meant to impress. It did. "We have helped 43 species reach this point in their development," Sale said, gesturing to a wall covered in shifting symbols. Some kind of record, Webb guessed. Each one faced a moment of crisis, a moment where their own aggression, or their own ignorance, nearly destroyed them. "We were there each time. We prevented catastrophe. We do not ask for gratitude. We ask only for patience and for trust." Reyes studied the wall of symbols carefully. Something about the phrase, "we prevented catastrophe," bothered her, though she could not say exactly why. "What happened to the species you couldn't save?" she asked. The room went quiet. Sael's expression, for the briefest moment, flickered, something that might have been sadness, or might have been something else entirely. "There have been losses," Sael admitted. "The galaxy is not always kind. That is precisely why the Concord exists, to reduce those losses, to make sure fewer young species face annihilation alone." It was a good answer. It was also, Reyes noted silently, not really an answer at all. Over the following months, the Concord fleet grew. What had been promised as a small defensive force became, gradually, an unmistakable presence. Dozens of ships in orbit, sensor arrays placed across the globe for early warning purposes, and Concord liaisons embedded in every major government and military command center on Earth. They were polite. They were helpful. They answered questions patiently and never raised their voices. And yet, piece by piece, human independence was being quietly folded away. Weapons research programs were paused for review. Space agencies found their launch schedules delayed for safety assessments. A new law, drafted with Concord assistance and passed under heavy diplomatic pressure, restricted any research into faster-than-light communication or travel until humanity had, in the words of the Concord Charter, demonstrated sufficient maturity. Marcus Webb watched his own research project, a decade of work into stable wormhole theory, get quietly shelved. When he asked why, the answer from his own government was almost apologetic. The Concord flagged it as high risk, his supervisor told him. They said species that develop faster than light travel too early tend to expand recklessly. Conflict with other species, you understand. Webb did not understand. Not really, but arguing against an alliance that could, with a single ship, level a city if it wanted to, felt like arguing with the weather. Still, something nagged at him. He began digging, quietly, through the data the Concord had shared about the other species in their protectorate. Most of it was carefully curated. Success stories, peaceful integration, grateful populations thriving under Concord guidance. But buried in an old translated document, meant for internal Concord use and shared with human scientists almost by accident, Webb found a single line that stopped him cold. "The Threk situation remains unresolved. Continued monitoring recommended. Direct engagement not advised at this time." There was no other context, no explanation of who or what the Threk were, just a name and a warning, buried and forgotten. He brought it to Reyes. They met in a small office late at night, away from Concord ears, or so they hoped, though nobody could be entirely sure anymore what the Concord could or could not hear. "Threk," Reyes repeated, reading the printout twice. "Never heard of them." "Neither had I," Webb said. "But look at the phrasing. Direct engagement not advised. That's not the language of an alliance talking about a species they're helping. That's the language of people talking about something they're afraid of." Reyes leaned back in her chair, thinking. She had spent enough of her life around military reports to recognize careful, evasive language when she saw it. Somebody, somewhere in the Concord, was worried about something called the Threk, and had decided the safest policy was to hope it never came looking. "You think that's the real threat," she said. "Not some vague danger they keep talking about. Something specific, something they're scared of." "I think," Webb said slowly, "that the Concord isn't as strong as they want us to believe. I think we've been so busy being grateful for their protection that nobody's asked the obvious question. Protection from what, exactly? And why do they need 40 ships in our orbit to provide it?" Neither of them had an answer yet, but the question would not leave them alone. 3 weeks later, everything changed. It began with silence. A Concord outpost on the edge of their territory, a small research station monitoring deep space activity, simply stopped transmitting. No warning, no distress call, nothing. One moment its signal was there, steady as it had been for years. The next, it was gone. The Concorde's response was immediate and telling. Ships were recalled from human orbit. Patrol patterns shifted. Ciel, who had always maintained a calm, reassuring presence in her meetings with human leaders, appeared before the United Nations with something in her expression that no human had seen on a Kellen face before. Fear. There has been an incident, she said, choosing her words with obvious care. It does not concern Earth directly. There is no cause for alarm. But her voice trembled, just slightly, on the word alarm, and Reyes, sitting in the audience, felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. Whatever the threat were, they were no longer just a name in a forgotten document. They were coming, and the great and powerful custodian Concorde, the alliance that had promised to protect humanity from every danger in the galaxy, looked, for the first time, genuinely afraid. That night, Reyes called an emergency meeting with the heads of Earth's remaining independent military forces, the ones the Concorde had not yet folded into their command structure. Webb was there too, along with a handful of scientists who had grown just as suspicious as he had. I don't know what's coming, Reyes told the room, but I know this. For 6 months, we've been told we're too weak, too young, too dangerous to protect ourselves. We've watched our research canceled, our weapons programs frozen, our space program grounded, all in the name of keeping us safe from a threat nobody would name. She paused, looking around at the tired, uncertain faces watching her. Well, now that threat has a name, and our protectors are scared of it, so I think it's time we stopped waiting to be protected, and started preparing to protect ourselves. Nobody in that room could have guessed, that night, just how right she would turn out to be, or how the galaxy's oldest alliance of protectors was about to learn a lesson about the species they thought was too fragile to matter, because humanity had never needed saving. It simply hadn't been given the chance to prove it yet. The weeks after the outpost went dark were strange ones. On the surface, life on Earth continued as it always had. People went to work, children went to school, the news cycle moved on to other stories. But underneath that ordinary surface, something had shifted. The Concorde's calm, confident mask had cracked, and once a crack like that appears, it is very hard to hide again. Ciel requested a private meeting with General Reyes and Dr. Webb, along with a small group of other trusted human officials. It took place not in the grand chambers of the alien ship, but in a plain, quiet room at the United Nations building, which felt, to Reyes, like a small but meaningful sign. The Concorde was coming to them now, not the other way around. Ciel looked tired. It was strange to see exhaustion on an alien face, but the signs were there. A slight dullness to her usually bright eyes, a stiffness in the way she moved. I owe you honesty, she said, before anyone could ask a question. More honesty than I have given so far. I believe that is now the wiser path. Reyes said nothing, waiting. The Threk, Ciel continued, are not a species we protect. They are a species we have avoided for over 300 years. They are old, older than the Concorde itself, and they do not build, they do not create. They take, they move from system to system, stripping worlds of resources, of populations, of anything useful, and leaving nothing behind but ruin. And the outpost that went dark, Webb asked quietly, was on the very edge of Threk territory, Ciel admitted. Its silence almost certainly means the Threk have moved, we do not yet know where. The room was silent for a long moment. You've been protecting us from small dangers, Reyes finally said, her voice flat and hard. Pirates, maybe. Rogue ships. Things you could handle, without breaking a sweat. But when it comes to something real, something that actually threatens you, you don't protect anyone. You run. Ciel flinched, but did not argue. The Concorde was built to prevent tragedy through caution, she said. Through careful, patient guidance. We are not a warrior people. We have not fought a true war in over 800 years. Our fleet is old. Our weapons are designed to deter, not to destroy. Against the Threk, we have never won a direct confrontation. We have only ever managed to avoid one. So what happens now? Webb asked. If they're coming this way? Then we do what we have always done, Ciel said. We prepare defenses. We warn nearby systems. We hope they move elsewhere. She hesitated. And if Earth is in their path, we will do everything in our power to shield you." Reyes almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. With what? Ships that haven't fought a war in 8 centuries? Sayel had no answer for that. After the meeting, Reyes and Webb walked out into the cool evening air together, saying nothing for a long while. Finally, Webb broke the silence. "You know what strikes me," he said. "For 6 months, they've told us we're not ready, that we're too aggressive, too unpredictable, too dangerous with our own weapons. And now it turns out the only reason they've survived this long against a real threat is by running away from it. Caution isn't a strategy," Reyes said. "It's just delay. Sooner or later, delay runs out." That night, for the first time since the Concorde's arrival, Reyes did something she had been holding back on. She called together every senior military officer she still trusted, from every nation that had quietly kept a portion of their forces outside Concorde oversight, and she laid out a simple plan. If the Concorde could not protect Earth, Earth would have to learn to protect itself, quietly, carefully, without provoking a direct confrontation with an alliance that still, for all its faults, had more advanced technology than humanity did. Old military research facilities, officially shut down under Concorde pressure, were quietly reopened under different names. Engineers and physicists who had lost their jobs when their programs were frozen were brought back, told simply that their work mattered again, and given very little explanation beyond that. Webb himself took charge of a small team looking again at the wormhole theory the Concorde had forced him to abandon. Not to build a working device yet, but simply to understand what humanity might be capable of if it were ever allowed to try. It was slow, careful, secretive work, and it might have stayed that way for years, if not for what happened 3 months later. A Concorde patrol ship, one of the smaller vessels stationed near the edge of the solar system, detected an anomaly. At first, it was dismissed as sensor error, readings that didn't match any known ship type, moving at speeds that seemed almost impossible. But the readings persisted, growing stronger, closer. By the time the Concorde confirmed what they were seeing, it was almost too late to prepare. A single Threk scout vessel had entered the outer solar system. It was not large, smaller than most Concorde ships, sleek and jagged, built with a strange asymmetry that made human engineers uneasy just looking at images of it. It moved with unsettling grace, weaving through the asteroid belt as if hunting for something. The Concorde fleet mobilized immediately, every ship in Earth's orbit rushing outward to intercept. Sayel contacted Reyes personally, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "This should only be a scout," she said. "A single ship, sent to gather information. If we destroy it quickly, quietly, there is a chance the larger Threk force will not learn what it finds here." "And if you don't destroy it quickly?" Reyes asked. "Then it reports back," Sayel said. "And within months, perhaps weeks, a full Threk fleet will come to investigate." The battle that followed was the first time humanity ever watched 2 alien forces fight, broadcast in fragments through military channels that Reyes made sure her people had access to, Concorde restrictions or not. It did not go the way anyone hoped. The Concorde ships opened fire first, a coordinated volley of energy weapons that should have, by every calculation Sayel's people had made, disabled the Threk scout within seconds. Instead, the small alien ship simply moved. It did not dodge in any pattern the Concorde's targeting systems could predict. It seemed to anticipate each shot before it was fired, sliding through gaps in the Concorde formation, with an almost casual ease. Then it fired back. A single Threk weapon strike tore through the hull of a Concorde cruiser, one of the largest ships in their fleet, and the vessel began to break apart, venting atmosphere and debris into the dark. The remaining ships scattered, trying to regroup, but the Threk scout was already moving toward the next target, weaving, striking, retreating, striking again. It took nearly 20 minutes, and the combined effort of 12 Concorde ships, to finally destroy the single Threk vessel. 2 Concorde ships were lost in the process. Dozens of crew members were dead. For one scout ship, not even a warship, a scout. Aboard the United Nations building, the room that had gathered to watch the battle's aftermath sat in stunned, heavy silence. "That was their weakest ship," Webb said quietly, staring at the data streaming in. "A scout, meant for reconnaissance, not combat. And it nearly wiped out an entire Concorde battle group." Reyes felt something settle in her chest, cold and certain. "We are not ready for this," she admitted. Nobody is ready for this. But there was something else in the data too. Something Webb had noticed almost immediately and could not stop staring at. He pulled up the recording again, slowing it down, studying the way the Threx ship had moved. "Look at this," he said, pointing. Every time it dodged in almost the same way. A slight curve, always the same angle, always the same timing. It's not random. It's a pattern. A very good pattern, but still a pattern. "So?" Reyes asked. "So the Concorde's targeting systems are old," Webb said. "Slow. Built to predict simple, straightforward threats. Pirates, rogue ships. Nothing this fast or unpredictable. They never adapted because they never had to. Their weapons technology has been sitting nearly unchanged for centuries because they haven't fought a real war in that long." He looked up at Reyes, something sharpening in his expression. "But we have," he said. "Not against aliens, but against each other. Humanity has spent all of history building better and better ways to predict, adapt, and outthink an enemy. It's ugly. It's something we're not proud of. But it means we're good at exactly the kind of problem the Concorde has forgotten how to solve." Reyes considered this for a long moment. "You're saying we could beat something like that? A Threx ship?" "I'm saying," Webb said carefully, "that the Concorde fought that battle the same way they've done everything for 800 years. Slow, cautious, by the book. And it barely worked, at a terrible cost, against the weakest ship the Threx have. If a real war comes, and I think it's coming, they are going to lose, unless someone brings something different to the fight." The next day, Reyes brought the recording, along with Webb's analysis, to a closed session with what remained of Earth's Independent Defense Command. She did not sugarcoat what she had to say. "The Concorde cannot protect us," she told them. "Not against this. Maybe not against anything. Not anymore. We've spent 6 months being told we were too dangerous, too aggressive, too unpredictable to be trusted with our own defense. It turns out that unpredictability might be the only thing that gives us a chance." She looked around the room at the tired, determined faces of soldiers and scientists who had spent months working in secret, preparing for a threat they had barely understood. "So we stop waiting for permission," she said. "We stop waiting to be protected. From this point forward, humanity builds its own defenses, trains its own forces, and prepares for a war the Concorde doesn't have the strength to win alone." Nobody in that room argued. Somewhere above them, in the dark of space, the wreckage of 2 Concorde warships still drifted, a quiet and terrible warning of what was coming. And far beyond the edge of the solar system, unseen and unheard, something vast was beginning to take notice of the small, strange blue world that had just destroyed one of its scouts. 6 months passed, and Earth changed in ways that would have seemed impossible only a year before. The Concorde, shaken by the loss of 2 warships to a single scout vessel, found itself in an unfamiliar position. It could no longer pretend to be the unquestioned protector of a weaker species. Sael, to her credit, did not try to hide this shift. She came before human leaders again, this time not with reassurances, but with a request. "We cannot face what is coming alone," she admitted. "Our fleet is old. Our tactics are old. We have spent centuries avoiding conflict, and now conflict has found us regardless. If Earth wishes to build its own defenses, the Concorde will not stand in the way. We will share what technology we can. We ask only that you share what you learn in return." It was, Reyes thought privately, the most honest thing a Concorde representative had ever said to a human. The restrictions lifted. Weapons research resumed, openly this time, with resources and urgency behind it. Space programs that had been grounded for a year suddenly found themselves fully funded, fast-tracked, pushed forward with a speed that stunned even the scientists working on them. Webb's small, secretive wormhole research team grew from 12 people to over 1,000, working alongside Concorde engineers who, for the first time, seemed genuinely curious about human ideas, instead of simply correcting them. It was not a smooth partnership. Concorde engineers were used to careful, methodical progress, testing every variable 100 times before moving forward. Human engineers, trained in a tradition of urgency and improvisation, wanted to build, test, break, and rebuild as fast as possible. The 2 approaches clashed constantly. But slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The clashes started producing results neither side could have reached alone. A Concorde propulsion engineer named Thren, working alongside a young human engineer named Aisha Nasser, found himself stunned one afternoon when Aisha suggested modifying a Concorde shield generator in a way that violated 3 separate safety protocols his people had followed for 2 centuries. "This will overload the containment field," he told her, running the numbers again to be sure. "The math is very clear." "The math is right," Aisha agreed, "if you're trying to hold the field steady the entire time. But what if you don't? What if you let it collapse and reform in pulses, faster than the enemy's targeting systems can track? You lose some efficiency, sure, but you gain unpredictability." Thren stared at her for a long moment. It was reckless. It was inelegant. It was, by every standard he had been trained to value, wrong. He built it anyway, quietly, on a testbed far from Concorde oversight. When he ran the simulation, the pulsing shield reduced hit probability from Threk-style unpredictable attack patterns by nearly 40% compared to the standard steady field. He did not sleep that night. He kept running the numbers, certain he had made an error. He had not. Word of results like this spread quickly through the joint research effort. Slowly, cautiously, some of the older Concorde engineers began to loosen their rigid methods, willing to try approaches that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. And human engineers, working alongside minds that had access to knowledge and technology centuries ahead of their own, learned faster than anyone had thought possible. Reyes, meanwhile, focused on something the Concorde had never needed in 800 years of peace: an actual fighting force, trained for war against an unpredictable, aggressive enemy. She drew on human military history for inspiration, not just the technology, but the philosophy. Concorde tactics were built around large, coordinated fleet movements, careful formations, predictable engagement patterns. Reyes threw much of that out. She trained pilots to think independently, to break formation when needed, to adapt mid-battle instead of waiting for orders. She built doctrine around speed, deception, and calculated risk, ideas that made her Concorde military liaisons visibly uncomfortable every time she explained them. "You are asking your pilots to disobey direct commands in the middle of battle," one Concorde officer said during a training review, his voice tight with disapproval. "This will create chaos, confusion, ships colliding with each other. This is not discipline. This is recklessness." "It's called initiative," Reyes told him flatly. "Your enemy doesn't fight in neat formations. Why should we?" The results, when they finally tested the new doctrine in simulated combat against recorded Threk attack patterns, silenced most of the skeptics. Human pilots, trained to break formation and adapt, survived simulated Threk engagements at nearly triple the rate of pilots using traditional Concorde tactics. It was not perfect. It was not proven in real combat yet, but it was progress, and progress was more than the Concorde had managed in centuries. 9 months after the scout ship's destruction, the peace ended. It began with silence again, the same pattern as before. A Concorde colony on the outer edge of their territory, a modest world of perhaps 2 million Kellen and allied species, stopped transmitting. This time, there was no ambiguity about what it meant. Long-range sensors picked up the signature clearly: a Threk fleet, larger than anything the Concorde had faced in recorded memory, moving through the colony system. The images that came back, in the hours before the last Concorde listening post in the area went dark, were the kind that no one who saw them would ever forget. Cities burning, ships torn apart in orbit. The Threk did not seem interested in conquest or occupation. They simply stripped what they wanted and destroyed the rest. Sael brought the news to Earth's leadership personally, her composure cracking for the first time since Reyes had known her. "They are moving in this direction," she said, slowly, but with purpose. "We do not know if Earth is a specific target, or simply lies in their general path, but we must assume the worst." "How long?" Reyes asked. "Months," Sael said. "Perhaps 6, perhaps less." The room fell into the kind of silence that comes before people either freeze or act. Reyes chose to act. "Then we have 6 months to finish what we started," she said. "No more slow, careful testing. No more centuries-old caution. We build, we train, we prepare, as fast as humanly possible." It was, everyone in that room understood, a race against time that humanity might well lose. But for the first time since the Concorde ships had first appeared in Earth's sky, Nobody in that room felt like they were simply waiting to be saved. They felt like they were preparing to fight. Over the following months, Earth transformed. Factories that had once produced cars and appliances were retooled to produce ship components, weapon systems, and defense platforms based on the hybrid human Concorde designs coming out of Webb and Thren's research teams. Every nation on Earth, despite decades of old rivalries and conflicts, found itself contributing to the same effort, driven by the simple, terrifying knowledge that no single country could survive what was coming alone. Aisha Nasser's shield modifications became standard across the growing human fleet. Reyes's adaptive combat doctrine was refined through thousands of simulated engagements, tested and retested against every scrap of threat combat data the Concorde could provide. Webb's wormhole research, though still far from a fully working device, produced something almost as valuable: a faster, more reliable communication system that lets scattered defense forces coordinate in ways the old Concorde networks never could. It was not enough time. Everyone involved knew that, but it was more than they'd had a year before, and it would have to do. 3 weeks before the Threk fleet was projected to reach the outer edge of the solar system, Reyes stood before the newly formed Earth Defense Fleet, 63 ships, built from a mix of salvaged Concorde technology and original human design, crewed by pilots trained in tactics that would have scandalized the Concorde's old military doctrine a year earlier. It was, by any galactic standard, a small and inexperienced force. Against the fleet that had destroyed an entire Concorde colony, it might not be enough. But as Reyes looked out at the assembled crews, human and Kalen standing side by side for the first time, as genuine allies rather than protector and protected, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Hope. Fierce, stubborn, human hope. "They told us we needed protecting," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled fleet. "They told us we were too young, too reckless, too dangerous to be trusted with our own defense. Maybe they were right, once, but not anymore." She paused, looking at the faces before her, human and alien, young and old, all of them bound now by the same uncertain future. "Whatever is coming," she said, "we will not wait to be saved. We will stand, together, and we will fight for every world that has ever needed someone brave enough to say no further." Far beyond the edge of the solar system, the Threk fleet continued its slow, patient advance, vast, ancient, and utterly certain of its own superiority. It had no idea what was waiting for it. The Threk fleet crossed into the outer solar system on a cold morning that no one on Earth actually saw as cold or as morning, since the fighting was happening far past the orbit of Neptune, in the endless dark where day and night meant nothing at all. But on Earth, people still thought of it that way. They watched the countdown on their screens, in kitchens and offices and crowded city squares, and they called it the morning the war began. Reyes stood on the bridge of her flagship, a vessel named Resolve, built from a Concorde frame but fitted almost entirely with human and hybrid systems. Around her, the Earth Defense Fleet held formation at the edge of the asteroid belt, 63 ships waiting in the dark for an enemy that outnumbered them more than 4 to 1. Sael stood beside her, no longer a diplomat in a quiet room, but a commander in her own right, leading the remaining Concorde ships that had chosen to fight alongside humanity rather than retreat to safer ground. It had not been an easy decision for the Concorde High Command. Many of their ships had already pulled back toward safer systems, unwilling to risk what remained of their aging fleet. But Sael, and a few hundred others who had come to respect what humanity had built in less than 2 years, had stayed. "Sensor contact," announced Aisha Nasser, who had left her engineering post to serve as tactical officer aboard the Resolve, insisting she wanted to see her own designs tested firsthand. "Confirmed. Threk fleet, main body, 612 vessels." The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 612, against 63. "Options," Reyes said, keeping her voice steady. "We can't meet them head-on," Aisha said. "Not in open formation. We'd be overwhelmed in minutes." "Then we don't fight them head-on," Reyes said. "We fight them the way we trained for. Fast, scattered, unpredictable. Make every one of our ships worth 10 of theirs." The plan had been built over months of simulation, refined and re-refined, but nothing could fully prepare anyone for the reality of 600 alien warships bearing down on a fraction of that number. Reyes gave the order, and the Earth defense fleet scattered into what looked, to any traditional military mind, like chaos. Ships broke into small independent groups of 3 and 4, each with its own pilot given freedom to act without waiting for central command. It was the opposite of everything the Concorde had ever taught about fleet combat. The Threk fleet, expecting a traditional formation to meet and be crushed, hesitated for the first time in the battle. Just a few seconds, but a few seconds mattered. The human ship struck fast, hitting the edges of the Threk formation in short, sharp bursts, before pulling back into the asteroid field, using the rocks and debris as cover, in a way no Concorde ship would have dared, given the risk of collision. Aisha's pulsing shield technology proved its worth almost immediately. Threk targeting systems, built to track steady, predictable energy signatures, struggled to lock onto ships whose defenses flickered and shifted in irregular patterns. It was not a clean victory. Ships were lost on both sides, and every loss on the human side felt enormous against such a small fleet. But for the first hour of battle, the Earth defense fleet held, striking and retreating, wearing down the edges of the massive Threk formation, instead of being crushed by its center. Then the Threk commander, whatever alien mind directed that vast and ancient fleet, adjusted its strategy. The main body of Threk ships split into smaller groups of their own, hunting the scattered human formations, instead of waiting for them to come close. "They're adapting," Aisha said, watching the sensor display shift. "They've never seen tactics like ours before, but they're learning fast." "Then we adapt faster," Reyes said. It became, over the following hours, less a single battle than hundreds of small, desperate fights scattered across a vast stretch of space. Human pilots, trained to think and act independently, found themselves making split-second decisions that no Concorde doctrine could have anticipated. A young pilot named Diego Ortiz, flying a small hybrid fighter, found himself and 2 wingmen surrounded by a cluster of 6 Threk vessels. Standard doctrine, human or Concorde, would have called for retreat or reinforcement. Instead, Ortiz did something that would be studied in military academies for decades afterward. He flew directly into the center of the Threk formation, so close that their weapons could not lock onto him without risking hitting each other, and used the confusion to let his wingmen strike the Threk ships from the outside. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It should not have worked. It worked. All 6 Threk vessels were destroyed. Ortiz's own fighter limped away with heavy damage, but he and his wingmen survived. Stories like this spread through the fleet's communication network almost as fast as the battle itself unfolded, thanks to the improved communication systems Webb's team had developed. Every small victory, every moment of unexpected human ingenuity, became fuel for the next pilot facing impossible odds. But numbers, in the end, are numbers, and by the 6th hour of battle, the Earth Defense Fleet had lost nearly a third of its ships. The Threk fleet, though bloodied, still vastly outnumbered what remained. Reyes watched the tactical display with a growing, cold certainty. They were not going to win this through attrition. Something had to change. It was Webb, monitoring the battle from a research station on Earth, who found the answer. Not a weapon, but an idea, born from the very wormhole research the Concorde had once forbidden. "We can't open a full wormhole," he said, speaking urgently over the command channel to Reyes. "The technology isn't there yet. Not for something that large, but we can create a small, unstable distortion, enough to disrupt local space for a short time. If we time it right, we could scatter their formation, throw off their sensors, maybe even damage ships caught too close to the distortion point." "How long to set it up?" Reyes asked. 20 minutes, if everything goes perfectly," Webb said. "And it's never been tested outside simulation." Reyes looked at the tactical display, at the ships she was losing minute by minute, at Sail's grim, determined face beside her. "Do it," she said. The 20 minutes that followed were among the longest of the war. The Earth Defense Fleet fought a desperate holding action, every ship pulling back toward a specific coordinate in space, where Webb's makeshift wormhole generator, built from a modified Concorde communication array, worked to build the unstable distortion needed. When it finally activated, the effect was more dramatic than anyone had predicted. A visible ripple spread through the battlefield, bending light and space around it in a way that made human and Threk sensors alike flare with static. Dozens of Threk ships caught near the center of the distortion found their systems overwhelmed, weapons misfiring, engines stalling. Several were torn apart by stresses their hulls were never designed to withstand. It was not a decisive blow. The Threk fleet, even wounded and disorganized, still vastly outnumbered the human and Concord forces remaining, but it bought something precious: time and confusion, in an enemy that had never once, in 300 years of raiding across the galaxy, faced a foe capable of surprising it twice in the same battle. The Threk fleet withdrew from close engagement, regrouping at a distance, clearly recalculating its approach against an enemy that refused to behave the way every previous target had behaved. In that pause, Reyes gathered what remained of her fleet, 31 ships, battered but still fighting, alongside Sael's surviving Concord vessels. "They're going to come back smarter," she told her officers over the command channel. "They've learned what we can do. Next time they won't be caught off guard." "Then what do we do?" Aisha asked. Reyes looked at the tactical display, at the wounded but unbroken Threk fleet regrouping in the distance, and at Earth, small and blue and impossibly far away, waiting behind them. "We make sure there isn't a next time," she said. "We end this here." It was, she knew, an enormous promise to make against a fleet that still outnumbered them nearly 10-1. But for the first time since the Threk had entered the solar system, Reyes allowed herself to believe it might actually be possible. Because for the first time in 800 years, the Threk had met an enemy that refused to be predictable, refused to be afraid, and refused, above all else, to be protected instead of fighting for itself. The pause in the fighting lasted only 40 minutes, but for the exhausted crews of the Earth Defense Fleet, it felt both far too short and strangely endless. Ships used the time to redistribute what little ammunition and power reserves remained. Medical teams worked frantically on the wounded. And on the bridge of the Resolve, Reyes, Sael, Aisha, and a handful of senior officers gathered to plan a final strategy against a fleet that still held every advantage of numbers. "We can't outlast them," Aisha said, studying the tactical display. "We've lost too many ships. If this becomes a fight of attrition, we lose." "Then it can't be a fight of attrition," Reyes said. "Webb, talk to me. Can we use the distortion trick again?" Webb's voice, tired but steady, came through the command channel from Earth. "Not the same way. They'll be watching for it now, keeping distance from any concentrated point, but I've been thinking about something else, based on the data from the first attempt." He explained his idea, and as he did, Reyes felt something shift in the room. Not quite hope, not yet, but the beginning of a plan. The theory was this: instead of trying to create one large distortion at a single point, which the Threk fleet would now avoid, Webb proposed creating a series of smaller, quicker distortions along a moving path, using the remaining human ships, spread out in a wide arc, each equipped with a modified version of the same technology. Individually, each distortion would be minor, barely noticeable, but if timed correctly, moving in sequence, they could create a corridor of disrupted space that the Threk fleet would be forced to either avoid entirely or fly directly through. "If they fly through it," Webb said, "their formation breaks apart, their sensors and weapons get scrambled, and for a short window, they'll be as blind and vulnerable as any fleet we've ever fought. If they avoid it, they get pushed away from Earth, buying us time to regroup, resupply, and bring in the last reserves we've been holding back." "And if it doesn't work?" Sael asked quietly. Webb did not have a comforting answer for that. "Then we'll have used the last of our power reserves on something that failed, and we'll have very little left to fight with." Reyes looked around the room, at the tired, determined faces of the people who had fought alongside her for the past 6 hours, and further back, for the past 2 years of preparation that had led to this single, desperate moment. "We've been underestimated for as long as anyone can remember," she said. "Told we were too young, too reckless, too small to matter in a galaxy full of older, wiser species. But every time someone has bet against us, we've found a way to prove them wrong. I don't intend to stop now." She gave the order. The maneuver took every remaining ship in the fleet, spread across a wide, curving formation, each one carrying a small device built in the final desperate hours before battle, based on Webb's rushed but careful calculations. It was, by any standard, an enormous gamble. 31 battered ships, betting everything on an untested theory against a fleet that still outnumbered them. The Threk fleet, regrouped and cautious after their earlier losses, began its advance once more, moving in a tighter, more disciplined formation than before, clearly determined not to be caught off guard a second time. As the two fleets closed the distance, the human and Concorde ships activated their devices in careful sequence, exactly as Webb had calculated. Ripples of disrupted space bloomed across the battlefield, one after another, forming an uneven, shifting corridor directly in the Threk fleet's path. For a moment, it seemed as though the Threk commander might successfully steer the fleet around the disruption entirely. The massive formation began to curve, adjusting course with the same eerie, coordinated precision that had made them so dangerous throughout the battle. But the corridor of distortions kept shifting, expanding, following Webb's carefully planned sequence, and slowly, the Threk fleet found itself with less and less room to maneuver. Within minutes, the largest portion of their formation had no choice but to pass directly through the disrupted region. The effect was immediate and devastating. Threk ships, their sensors and weapon systems thrown into chaos by the rippling distortions, began colliding with each other, firing wildly at targets that weren't there, engines misfiring and stalling. The tight, disciplined formation that had made the Threk fleet so dangerous collapsed into confusion. "Now," Reyes said, and the order went out across the fleet. The remaining human and Concorde ships surged forward, striking at the disorganized Threk formation with everything they had left. It was not a clean, easy victory. The Threk fleet still fought back fiercely, and more human and Concorde ships were lost in those final, desperate minutes than at any other point in the battle. But the disruption held long enough, and the human fleet's aggression was fierce enough, that the tide of the battle finally, unmistakably, turned. What remained of the Threk fleet, faced with losses it had never before experienced in 3 centuries of raiding across the galaxy, did something that no record in Concorde history had ever seen a Threk fleet do. It retreated. The remaining ships broke formation entirely, scattering away from the battlefield, abandoning whatever plans they had held for Earth and the surrounding systems. Sensor stations tracked their retreat for hours afterward, watching as the once massive fleet fled back toward the depths of unknown space, far faster than they had approached. On the bridge of the Resolve, no one cheered right away. The silence that followed the retreat felt too large, too heavy with the cost of what had just happened. 32 ships had been lost, thousands of lives, human and Concorde both. But Earth was still there, small and blue and impossibly precious, hanging safely behind them. It was Sael who finally broke the silence, turning to Reyes with an expression that no human present had ever seen on a Kalen face before, something between awe and quiet, humbled respect. "In 800 years," she said softly, "the Concorde has never once defeated a Threk fleet in direct battle. We have only ever survived by avoiding them entirely." She paused. "Today, a species we called too young, too reckless, too dangerous to protect itself, did what we could never do." Reyes did not feel triumphant. She felt exhausted, and heavy with grief for everyone who had not survived the day. But beneath that exhaustion, something else was there too, a quiet, hard-won certainty that would shape everything that followed. "We didn't do it because we were fearless," she said. "We did it because we finally got the chance to try." News of the battle reached Earth within hours, spreading across every screen and channel on the planet. People who had spent 2 years watching their governments quietly rebuild an independent defense force, uncertain whether it would ever be needed, now watched footage of humanity's first great victory against an enemy older and more powerful than anything they had ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between humanity and the Concorde changed in ways that no diplomat could have predicted a year before. Sael, promoted within the Concorde's leadership structure after the battle, became one of the loudest voices arguing for a complete restructuring of the Alliance's approach to younger species, not as fragile children needing protection and restriction, but as potential partners with their own strengths to offer. The Concorde's old policy of guiding and restricting young civilizations, born from centuries of caution and fear, began to shift toward something new, genuine partnership, built on mutual respect rather than one-sided protection. Webb's wormhole research, once forbidden entirely, became one of the most heavily funded joint projects in Concorde history, with human and Kalen scientists working side by side as true equals. Reyes's combat doctrine, once dismissed as reckless and dangerous, became required study for Concord military academies across dozens of member worlds. And humanity, once told it was too young, too aggressive, too unpredictable to be trusted with its own future, found itself instead becoming something the Concord had not had in 800 years, of careful, fearful peace. A protector. Not because humans had ever needed saving, but because, given the chance, they had proven they were the ones capable of doing the saving all along. Years later, when new species were discovered on the edges of Concord territory, frightened and uncertain about their place in a vast and dangerous galaxy, it was not only Kalen ambassadors who came to greet them. It was human envoys too, standing alongside their old allies, offering not just protection, but the simple, hard-earned truth that had defined humanity's own difficult journey among the stars. Nobody stays weak forever, not if they are given the chance, and the courage, to stand up and prove otherwise. And when the next great danger eventually came, as it always does in the vast and uncertain dark of the galaxy, it would find Earth standing not behind its protectors, but beside them, ready, at last, to protect in return.